They said humans were never meant to leave the ground. For thousands of years we watched birds soar through the sky with envy burning in our hearts, convinced that flight was a gift reserved only for angels and creatures with wings. But on a crisp autumn morning in 1783, one man decided to prove everyone wrong. His name was Jean-François Pilâtre de Rozier, and he was about to do something no human had ever done before. He was going to fly. What you're about to discover is the real story behind humanity's first flight. It wasn't a tale of careful planning and safety measures. It was a story of obsession, jealousy, and a dangerous gamble that almost killed the man who dared to dream. This is the story of how one person's insane courage changed the course of human history forever. The man who refused to stay grounded. Jean-François Pilâtre de Rozier was not a typical man of his era. Born in 1754 in the French city of Metz, he grew up fascinated by the natural world. While other children played with wooden toys, young Pilâtre dissected insects and studied the movement of clouds. By his 20s, he had become a respected teacher of physics and chemistry in Paris, conducting spectacular public demonstrations that drew crowds of amazed spectators. But Pilâtre wasn't satisfied with mere ground-based experiments. He had a secret obsession that consumed his every waking moment. He wanted to fly, not like Icarus with wax wings, but truly fly, defying gravity itself. His friends thought he was mad. His colleagues warned him that such dreams would lead to his death. But Pilâtre couldn't stop thinking about it. Everything changed in June 1783 when two brothers named Joseph Michel and Jacques-Étienne Montgolfier demonstrated something extraordinary in the town of Annonay. They had created a massive balloon made of paper and fabric, and when they filled it with hot air from a fire, the balloon rose into the sky. It flew for 10 minutes and travelled over a mile before landing in a field. The news spread across France like wildfire. People couldn't believe it. A man-made object had actually flown. But here's what most people don't know. The Montgolfier brothers never intended to put a human inside their invention. They were terrified of what might happen. The scientific community of 1783 had no idea whether a human could survive at high altitudes. Would the air become unbreathable? Would the pressure cause your blood to boil? Would you freeze to death? Nobody knew. The race begins. When Pilâtre heard about the Montgolfier brothers' success, he became obsessed. He immediately travelled to meet them and begged to be part of their experiments. But he wasn't the only one with this dream. All across Paris, scientists, adventurers, and daredevils were approaching the brothers with the same request. Let me be the first human to fly. The Montgolfiers were cautious. They decided to start with animal passengers first. On September 19th, 1783, they sent up a sheep named Mont au ciel, which means climb to the sky, a duck and a rooster in a basket beneath their balloon. King Louis XIII and Queen Marie Antoinette watched from the Palace of Versailles as the balloon rose into the air with its animal crew. The flight lasted 8 minutes. When the balloon landed, all 3 animals were alive and well. The sheep had eaten all the food in the basket, completely unbothered by its journey through the sky. This was proof that living creatures could survive flight. Now the question was, who would be the first human brave enough to try? This is where our story takes a dark turn. King Louis XVI, upon hearing that the Montgolfiers wanted to send a human passenger, made a disturbing suggestion. He proposed that they should use a condemned criminal for the first flight. After all, if something went wrong, society wouldn't lose anyone important. The criminal would either survive and earn his freedom, or die performing a service to science. It was a win-win situation, at least in the king's mind. But Pilâtre de Rozier was outraged by this idea. He went directly to the king and made an impassioned argument. "Shall we allow the glory of being the first human to ascend to the skies to go to a criminal?" he declared. "This achievement should belong to someone who understands the magnitude of what we are accomplishing." His boldness impressed the king, who eventually agreed. Pilâtre would get his chance. The tethered tests. But the Montgolfier brothers weren't ready to let Pilâtre fly freely just yet. They insisted on a series of tethered tests first. In October 1783, they built a massive balloon 70 feet tall and 50 feet in diameter, decorated in beautiful blue and gold designs. The balloon was named Aérostat Réveillon, after the wallpaper manufacturer who had donated the fabric. Beneath the balloon hung a circular gallery where passengers could stand. At the centre was a brazier, a metal basket that would hold a fire. This fire was the key to everything. As the fire burned, it heated the air inside the balloon, making it lighter than the surrounding atmosphere. This hot air provided the lift that would carry the balloon skyward. On October 15, 1783, Pilâtre climbed into the gallery for his first test. The balloon was tethered to the ground with ropes, able to rise only about 80 feet. As workers stoked the fire in the brazier, Pilâtre felt the balloon begin to lift. For the first time in his life, the ground fell away beneath his feet. He looked down at the upturned faces of the crowd below and felt a rush of exhilaration unlike anything he had ever experienced. But staying aloft wasn't easy. Pilâtre quickly discovered that he had to constantly feed the fire with straw to maintain the balloon's altitude. If the fire died down even slightly, the balloon would begin to descend. It was exhausting work and terrifying. At one point, a gust of wind caused the balloon to tilt violently, and embers from the brazier fell onto the fabric of the balloon. Pilâtre had to frantically stamp out the sparks before they could set the entire balloon ablaze. Despite the danger, Pilâtre was thrilled. He conducted several more tethered flights over the next few weeks, sometimes staying aloft for up to 20 minutes. Each time, he learned more about how to control the balloon by managing the fire. He also discovered something the Montgolfier brothers hadn't realized. Flying was addictive. The rivalry. But Pilâtre wasn't the only person racing to achieve the first free flight. A rival inventor named Jacques Charles was working on a different design. Instead of using hot air, Charles was experimenting with hydrogen gas, which was much lighter than air and didn't require a constant fire. Charles believed his design was superior and safer. He was determined to beat Pilâtre and the Montgolfiers to the record. The competition became bitter. Newspapers in Paris took sides, with some supporting the Montgolfiers' hot air balloon and others championing Charles's hydrogen design. Bets were placed on who would fly first. The pressure on Pilâtre was immense. He knew that if Charles succeeded first, all of his work and risk would be forgotten. The Montgolfier brothers, feeling the pressure as well, finally agreed it was time for a free flight one without tethers. But they had one condition. Pilâtre couldn't go alone. They insisted he take a passenger with him. The person they chose was François Laurent d'Arlandes, a military officer and member of the French nobility. D'Arlandes was brave, but had far less experience with the balloon than Pilâtre. Some historians believe the Montgolfiers chose d'Arlandes because his noble status would bring more prestige to their achievement. Pilâtre wasn't happy about sharing the glory, but he had no choice. The date was set. November 23rd, 1783. The day that changed everything. The morning of November 20th dawned cold and clear. The launch site was in the Bois de Boulogne, a large park on the western edge of Paris. By early afternoon, thousands of spectators had gathered to witness history. Among them were members of the royal court, scientists, artists, and ordinary Parisians who had walked miles to see this incredible event. The balloon was a magnificent sight. It stood taller than a 6-story building decorated with elaborate golden designs, zodiac symbols, and the royal fleur-de-lis. The gallery beneath it had 2 stations opposite each other, where Pilâtre and d'Arlandes would stand with their supplies of straw to feed the fire. At 1:54 p.m. the order was given to release the tethers. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, majestically, the balloon began to rise. The crowd erupted in cheers and screams of amazement. Pilâtre and d'Arlandes waved to the spectators below as they climbed higher and higher into the sky. But inside the gallery, things were far from celebratory. The balloon was rising too quickly, and Pilâtre realized they were burning through their straw supply faster than expected. He shouted instructions to Darlander about when to add more fuel to the fire. The roar of the flames and the rush of wind made communication difficult. As they rose above 500 feet, Pilâtre looked down and felt a moment of pure terror. The people below looked like ants. The buildings of Paris stretched out in every direction. He could see the Seine River winding through the city like a silver ribbon. No human eye had ever seen this view before. He was higher than any cathedral spire, higher than any mountain he had climbed. If something went wrong now, the fall would certainly kill them both. Darlander, meanwhile, was frozen with fear. He gripped the railing of the gallery with white knuckles, unable to help with managing the fire. This meant Pilâtre had to run back and forth across the gallery, feeding both sides of the brazier to keep the balloon level. Sweat poured down his face despite the cold air. Then disaster nearly struck. A spark from the brazier landed on the fabric of the balloon and began to smoulder. Pilâtre noticed smoke rising and realized with horror that the balloon was starting to burn. He grabbed a sponge they had brought for drinking water and frantically dabbed at the burning spot. For several terrifying seconds, he worked to extinguish the embers while the balloon continued to rise. If the fire spread, the entire balloon would be consumed in flames, and they would plummet to their deaths. But Pilâtre's quick thinking saved them. He put out the fire just in time. Taking a deep breath, he looked at Darlander, who was now pale and shaking. "We're going to make it," Pilâtre said, more to convince himself than his companion. The landing. The flight lasted 25 minutes in total. They travelled approximately 5.5 miles, drifting with the wind over Paris. Pilâtre carefully managed their altitude by controlling the fire, bringing them lower as they approached the outskirts of the city. Finding a landing spot was tricky. They needed an open area away from buildings and trees. Finally, Pilâtre spotted a suitable field and allowed the fire to die down. The balloon began to descend. As they approached the ground, Pilâtre called out to Darlander to brace himself. The landing was rough. The basket hit the ground hard and tipped over on its side. Both men were thrown around inside but miraculously uninjured. Local workers who had been tending the fields rushed over, terrified by what they had witnessed. They thought the balloon was some kind of demon or monster falling from the sky. But when Pilâtre and Darlander climbed out of the gallery, laughing and embracing each other, the workers realized these were just men who had done the impossible. Word spread quickly. By the time Pilâtre and Darlander made it back to Paris, they were heroes. The entire city celebrated their achievement. King Louis XVI awarded them medals and money. Scientists from across Europe wrote letters of congratulation. Pilâtre de Rozier's name was on everyone's lips. He had achieved his dream. He had become the first human to fly. The tragic epilogue. But this story doesn't have a completely happy ending. Pilâtre's success sparked a ballooning craze across Europe. Dozens of inventors tried to improve on the Montgolfier design. The rivalry with Jacques Charles continued, and Charles successfully flew his hydrogen balloon just 10 days after Pilâtre's flight, travelling even farther. Pilâtre couldn't accept being second in anything related to flight. He became obsessed with crossing the English Channel by balloon, a feat no one had yet accomplished. In 1785 he designed a hybrid balloon that used both hot air and hydrogen, thinking this would give him more control and range. On June 15, 1785, Pilâtre and a passenger named Pierre Romain attempted to cross the Channel from France to England. But the combination of hot air and hydrogen proved to be a fatal mistake. About 30 minutes into the flight, the hydrogen gas ignited, possibly from a spark from the hot air brazier. The balloon exploded in a massive fireball and plummeted to the ground. Both Pilâtre and Romain were killed instantly. Pilâtre de Rozier died at age 30, less than 2 years after achieving his greatest dream. He became the first person to fly, and also the first person to die in an aviation accident. It was a tragically fitting end for a man who had always been willing to risk everything for the thrill of defying gravity. the legacy today. When you board an airplane and fly thousands of miles without a second thought, remember Pilâtre de Rozier. Remember the courage it took to climb into that balloon when no one knew if humans could survive flight. Remember that before there were jet engines and pressurized cabins, before the Wright brothers and their airplane, there was one man who looked at a fabric balloon and a fire and decided that was enough to challenge the heavens. Pilâtre's flight on November 20th, 1783, lasted only 25 minutes and covered just 5.5 miles. But in those 25 minutes, he changed the course of human history. He proved that we didn't have to stay bound to the earth. He showed that with courage, ingenuity, and a willingness to face the unknown, humans could conquer even the sky itself. Every pilot who has ever flown, every astronaut who has travelled to space, every person who has looked out an airplane window and marvelled at the clouds below, they all owe a debt to Jean-François Pilâtre de Rozier, the first human brave enough to fly.